The cup trembled in my hands as I watched Lucas through the kitchen window. He was sitting on the back porch, scrolling through his phone with that same distant expression he'd worn for months now. The evening light caught the gray streaks in his hair. When had my little boy started looking so much older than his 32 years? I set the coffee down and touched the small bruise on my wrist where he'd grabbed me yesterday. Not hard enough to really hurt, but firm enough to make his point clear. He didn't want me asking about his job interviews anymore. "Just give me space, Mom," he'd said, his voice carrying an edge I'd never heard before. "You wouldn't understand." The house felt too quiet these days. After Richard passed 2 years ago, I'd thought having Lucas move back home would fill the emptiness. Instead, it seemed to magnify it. Every morning I made breakfast for two. Scrambled eggs just the way he liked them, fresh orange juice, toast with the honey butter he'd loved since childhood. Most mornings, he'd grab a piece of toast and disappear into his room with barely a word. I pulled out the photo album from the kitchen drawer, the one I kept hidden now. There we were, Lucas at 8, gap-toothed and grinning, his arms wrapped around my neck after his first school play. Lucas at 16, rolling his eyes but still letting me kiss his cheek before prom. Lucas at 25, calling me every Sunday from his apartment across town, sharing stories about his job at the marketing firm, asking for my famous pot roast recipe. When did those Sunday calls stop? When did my presence become an inconvenience instead of a comfort? The front door slammed shut, making me jump. Lucas was going out again, probably to meet those friends of his who always seemed to have money for drinks but never for rent. I watched through the window as he walked to his car, his shoulders hunched against the world. He didn't look back at the house. He never looked back anymore. I touched the insurance money envelope hidden behind the flour canister. $43,000, what was left of Richard's life insurance after the funeral expenses. I'd been saving it, thinking maybe Lucas and I could take a trip together when he felt better. Maybe visit those lighthouses in Maine he used to draw as a child. Or maybe help him get back on his feet, find a new apartment, start fresh. But every time I mentioned the money, his eyes would light up in a way that made my stomach twist. Not with gratitude, but with calculation, as if he was measuring how much he could get from me, and how quickly. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. "Elena? It's Margaret from the book club." "Oh, hello, Margaret." I tried to inject some cheerfulness into my voice. "We missed you again this week. Are you feeling all right, dear?" I glanced toward Lucas's empty room. How could I explain that I didn't want to leave the house because those were the only hours he might actually talk to me? That I was afraid if I wasn't here when he needed something, he might stop needing me altogether? "I'm fine, just a bit tired lately." "Well, you know you're always welcome. Sarah was just saying how much she misses your insights about the characters. You always see things the rest of us miss." After Margaret hung up, I sat in the growing darkness of my kitchen, thinking about her words. I'd always been good at reading people, at seeing past their words to their real feelings. It's what made me a good teacher for 30 years. But with Lucas, I kept making excuses for what I saw. I kept telling myself that grief and disappointment could explain the coldness in his eyes when he looked at me now. The refrigerator hummed in the silence. I'd made his favorite dinner tonight, beef stew with those small potatoes he used to fish out of his bowl first. It was still sitting on the stove, untouched. He'd texted that he was eating with friends. If you like emotional stories, please subscribe. We're trying to reach 1,000 friends here. And tell me, from which city are you watching? I walked to my bedroom and caught my reflection in Richard's mirror. 55 years old, silver threading through my brown hair, laugh lines that had forgotten how to smile. When had I started looking so tired? When had I started looking so forgettable? From Lucas's room came the sound of his phone buzzing with notifications. Even when he was gone, his presence filled the house with reminders of how little I mattered to him now. I thought about the last time he'd hugged me. Really hugged me. Not just that quick pat on the shoulder when I handed him money for gas. It had been months ago, right after Richard's funeral. His arms had felt so strong around me, and for a moment, I'd thought we would grieve together, heal together. Instead, he'd pulled away and asked if I knew where Dad kept the important papers. Tonight, as I prepared for another evening alone, I tried to remember the last time Lucas had asked how I was feeling. Not about money, not about what was for dinner, but about me, about the woman who had carried him for 9 months, who had walked him to school every day until he begged her to stop, who had cheered at every soccer game and saved every report card and believed in him even when he'd stopped believing in himself. I couldn't remember. And that realization settled in my chest like a stone, heavy and cold, and impossible to ignore. Something was changing between us, something I didn't want to name. But as I turned off the kitchen light and headed upstairs to another night of sleeping alone in a house that used to feel like home, I knew that pretending everything was normal wasn't protecting either of us anymore. It was just postponing the moment when I'd have to face the truth about what my beloved son was becoming, and what I might need to do about it. The next morning, I woke to the sound of the microwave beeping downstairs. Lucas was already up, heating something from a takeout container. When I reached the kitchen, he barely glanced my direction. "Good morning, honey. I made fresh coffee," I offered, gesturing toward the pot I'd started 20 minutes earlier when I heard him stirring. "Already got mine." He held up a gas station cup, the kind that cost $3 when coffee at home was free. The message was clear. Even my coffee wasn't worth accepting anymore. I watched him scroll through his phone while eating cold Chinese food for breakfast. His hair was disheveled, and yesterday's clothes hung wrinkled on his frame. "Lucas, there's a job fair downtown today. The community college is hosting it, and I saw several companies that might be—" "Mom." His voice cut through the air like a blade. "I don't need you to manage my life. I'm 32, not 12. The words stung more than they should have. I busied myself wiping already clean counters. I just thought, that's the problem. You think too much about things that aren't your business anymore." He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that made me flinch. As he walked past me toward the stairs, I caught a whiff of something sharp and bitter, not just morning breath, but something else. Something that reminded me of the way Richard's breath smelled during his worst days, when the pain medication made him a stranger in his own body. "Lucas, are you feeling all right? You seem—" "I'm fine. God, do you have to analyze everything?" He paused at the bottom of the stairs, his hand gripping the banister so tightly his knuckles went white. "Can't you just exist without commenting on every single thing I do?" Exist. As if that's all I was supposed to do now. Just exist in his presence without speaking, without caring, without being the mother who had spent 3 decades learning to read his moods and needs better than anyone else in the world. After he disappeared upstairs, I stood in my kitchen listening to the sounds of him moving around above me, drawers slamming, the shower running for barely 2 minutes, his heavy footsteps pacing back and forth across the floorboards. The ceiling creaked under his agitation, and I found myself mapping his movements like I used to when he was a teenager sneaking around after curfew. But this felt different, dangerous, somehow. The doorbell rang around noon. I opened it to find Mrs. Patterson from next door, holding a casserole dish and wearing the expression she reserved for delivering bad news gently. "Elena, dear, I hope you don't mind me stopping by." "Of course not, Ruth. Come in." I led her to the living room, grateful for any human interaction that didn't involve walking on eggshells. She set down the casserole and folded her hands in her lap. "I wanted to talk to you about Lucas." My stomach tightened. "What about him?" "Well, last night around 2 in the morning, I heard shouting coming from your house. And this morning, I noticed some of my garden tools were missing from my shed." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The lock was broken." I stared at her, processing the implications. "Are you saying Lucas took your tools?" "I'm not accusing anyone of anything. But Elena, honey, I'm worried about you." The shouting I heard, it sounded angry, really angry. The shouting. I remembered now, vaguely, being pulled from deep sleep by raised voices. But in my grogginess, I'd assumed it was the television, or maybe neighbors arguing outside. The idea that Lucas had been shouting, in my house, in the middle of the night, sent ice through my veins. "Ruth, I'm sure there's an explanation. Where was Lucas last night?" He was out with friends until late. He came home around midnight." But even as I said it, I realized I wasn't sure. I'd been asleep. He could have left again, could have been anywhere, could have done anything. Ruth reached over and squeezed my hand. "Elena, you know I loved that boy like my own when he was growing up. But people change sometimes, especially when they're struggling with certain things." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "My grandson Danny works at that bar downtown, Murphy's. He sent me this yesterday, said he thought I should know." She showed me a photo taken from across a crowded room. Lucas was sitting at a table with 3 other men, but it wasn't the beer in front of him that caught my attention. It was his expression, hollow-eyed and desperate, The way Richard looked near the end when the pain got so bad that nothing helped anymore. Danny says they've been meeting there almost every night for weeks. Says they're always talking about money, about people who owe them, about getting even with folks who've wronged them. Ruth's voice dropped to a whisper. Elena, those aren't good people Lucas is spending time with. After Ruth left, I sat alone in my living room, staring at the spot where Richard's chair used to sit. The house felt different now, charged with a tension I couldn't name. Every creak of the floorboards above made me jump. When Lucas came downstairs around 3, whistling under his breath, I studied his face for signs of the anger Ruth had heard in the night. Hey, Mom. His tone was almost cheerful, but his eyes didn't meet mine. What's for dinner? I was thinking of making that chicken parmesan you used to love. Sounds good. He headed toward the front door, keys jingling in his hand. Where are you going? He paused, his hand on the doorknob. For a moment, his mask slipped, and I saw something cold flash across his features. Out. When will you be back? Does it matter? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. We both knew he wasn't really asking about dinner timing. He was asking whether my needs, my feelings, my very presence in his life mattered at all anymore. Of course it matters. You're my son. Yeah, well. He opened the door, letting in a gust of cold air that made me shiver. Sometimes I wish I could change that. The door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the picture frames on the nearby table. One of them, a photo of Lucas at his college graduation, his arm around my shoulders, both of us beaming with pride, tilted sideways and crashed to the floor. I knelt to pick up the broken glass, cutting my finger on a sharp edge. As I watched my blood mix with the fragments of our happy memory, I realized that Ruth's warning had come too late. Whatever was happening to Lucas, whatever darkness was growing inside him, it had already taken root in our home. And for the first time since Richard died, I was truly afraid. Not of being alone, but of the stranger my son was becoming. The stranger who lived in my house, ate my food, took my money, and looked at me like I was an obstacle to be removed rather than a mother to be loved. The cut on my finger throbbed as I swept up the glass, each piece catching the afternoon light, like tiny warning signals I'd been too blind to see. 3 days passed before Lucas came home again. I'd left the porch light on every night, made fresh meals that went untouched, checked my phone countless times for messages that never came. When I finally heard his key in the lock at 2 a.m, relief flooded through me so intensely I had to grip the kitchen counter to stay upright. Lucas? Thank God, I was so worried. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, and my words died in my throat. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, his face gaunt in a way that made my chest ache. But it was his eyes that stopped me cold. They were flat, empty, like looking into a house where all the lights had been turned off. You saved dinner for me? He noticed the covered plate I'd left on the counter, the same routine I'd followed for 3 nights running. Of course, it's your favorite, pot roast with carrots, and I hate pot roast. His voice was matter-of-fact, casual, as if he hadn't spent years asking me to make it for his birthday dinners. I've always hated it. But you never bothered to ask what I actually like, did you? The words hit me like a physical blow. But Lucas, you always said, I said what you wanted to hear because it was easier than dealing with your disappointment. He picked up the plate and scraped its contents directly into the garbage disposal, not even bothering to separate the food from the good china, just like I do with everything else. I watched 3 hours of careful preparation disappear down the drain, but the waste of food wasn't what made my eyes water. It was the casual cruelty in his voice, the way he destroyed my effort without a flicker of recognition that I'd spent the day trying to show love the only way I knew how. I didn't know you felt that way. My voice came out smaller than I intended. There's a lot you don't know about me, Mom. There's a lot you've never bothered to learn. He leaned against the counter, studying me with the detached interest of someone examining an insect. For instance, did you know that every Sunday when I called you from my apartment, I was drunk? Did you know that I got fired from the marketing job 6 months before I told you? Did you know that the reason I really moved back here had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with the fact that I got evicted? Each revelation was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut through every assumption I'd held about our relationship. I sank into a kitchen chair, my legs no longer capable of supporting the weight of this new reality. Why didn't you tell me? I could have helped, because I didn't want your help. I wanted your money. The honesty was brutal, stunning. I wanted access to Dad's insurance money, and the easiest way to get it was to move in here and wait for you to offer it, which, knowing you, was inevitable. The kitchen spun around me. That's not... You can't mean that. Can I? He opened the refrigerator and grabbed a beer, popping it open with the same casual indifference he'd used to destroy dinner. You want to know what I really think about when I look at you, Mom? I think about how pathetic it is that you've built your entire identity around being needed by people who don't actually need you anymore. I tried to stand, to leave the room, to escape the systematic destruction of everything I'd believed about my son's love. But he continued talking, his voice following me like smoke. Dad used to laugh about it, you know. After you'd fuss over him all day, bringing him pillows and magazines and hovering like some kind of nurse, he'd tell me how exhausting it was to be the center of your universe. He said it was like being suffocated by good intentions. That's not true. But even as I said it, I remembered Richard's tired sighs when I'd ask if he needed anything, the way he'd sometimes close his eyes when I entered the room, as if my presence was more burden than comfort. He was planning to divorce you. Lucas took a long sip of beer, watching my face carefully. Before the cancer diagnosis, he'd already talked to a lawyer. The lie, because it had to be a lie, landed like a physical blow to my chest. I gripped the back of the chair so hard my knuckles went white. Stop it. He showed me the papers, said 28 years was long enough to spend with someone who confused suffocation with love. Lucas's voice never changed tone, never betrayed even a hint of emotion. The only reason he didn't go through with it was because he got sick, and then he felt trapped all over again, just in a different way. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Why are you telling me this? Because I'm tired of pretending. He finished his beer and tossed the empty bottle into the sink, where it clanged against my good dishes with a sound like breaking glass. I'm tired of pretending I'm grateful for your sacrifices. I'm tired of pretending that your love feels like love instead of like ownership. He started toward the stairs, then paused, turning back with something that might have been pity in his eyes. You know what the worst part is? You actually think you're a good mother. You think that forcing your love on people who don't want it makes you some kind of saint. But all you've ever done is make the people around you feel guilty for not being who you need them to be. I listened to his footsteps on the stairs, each one echoing through the house like a countdown to something I didn't want to face. When his bedroom door slammed shut, the sound reverberated through my bones, final as a coffin lid closing. I sat in my kitchen until dawn, staring at the empty beer bottle in the sink, trying to separate the cruelty from the truth in everything Lucas had said. The house felt different around me now, not like a home, but like a museum dedicated to a life that had never really existed. Every photograph on every wall, every carefully chosen piece of furniture, every small comfort I'd created over 30 years of marriage and motherhood, all of it suddenly seemed like evidence of my own self-deception. Had I really been suffocating the people I loved with my need to be needed? Had my care been so oppressive that my own husband had planned to escape it? Had I spent decades mistaking possession for love, control for compassion? The questions circled through my mind like vultures, picking at the bones of every memory I'd treasured. Lucas's first steps. Had I pushed him to walk before he was ready because I needed the milestone more than he did? His college graduation. Had my pride in his achievements been about his success, or my own validation as a mother? Richard's illness. Had my constant attention been comfort or torture for a man who just wanted to die with dignity? When the sun finally rose, painting my kitchen in soft gold light, I realized that Lucas had accomplished something remarkable with his cruelty. He'd made me question not just our relationship, but my entire understanding of love itself. And the most terrifying part was that some of what he'd said felt true. Not all of it. I couldn't believe Richard had wanted to leave me. Couldn't accept that every moment of our marriage had been a lie. But some of it. The suffocation. The way I'd built my identity around being indispensable to people who might have been happier with more space to breathe. I thought about my book club friends. How I'd stopped attending meetings because I didn't want to leave Lucas alone. I thought about the volunteer opportunities I'd declined, the friendships I'd let fade, the hobbies I'd abandoned, all in service of being available for a son who apparently saw my availability as a burden rather than a gift. As I watched the morning light chase shadows across my kitchen walls, I began to understand something that hurt worse than all of Lucas's accusations combined. Maybe I hadn't just been a victim of his cruelty. Maybe I'd been a willing participant in my own diminishment, shrinking myself so completely to fit into the spaces other people left for me that I'd forgotten I was supposed to take up space of my own. The realization should have destroyed me. Instead, something strange happened. For the first time in months, I felt completely alone in my house, but not lonely, just quiet, like the eye of a storm, where everything was still and clear and strangely peaceful. It was in that stillness that I heard it, a small voice I'd been ignoring for years, buried under layers of other people's needs and expectations. It was my own voice, and it was asking a question I'd been afraid to hear. Who was I supposed to be when no one needed me to be anyone else? The days that followed blurred together in a haze of careful distance. I stopped making breakfast for two, stopped leaving dinner on the counter, stopped asking questions that would only earn me contempt, disguised as honesty. Instead, I moved through my house like a ghost, present but not participating, existing in the spaces Lucas didn't claim as his own. He seemed to prefer this new version of me, the one who didn't speak unless spoken to, who didn't offer unwanted care, who had learned to make herself invisible. Sometimes I caught him watching me with what might have been relief, as if my silence had finally given him permission to breathe freely in his childhood home. I took my coffee to the back porch each morning, sitting in the wicker chair Richard had bought me for our 20th anniversary. The garden was overgrown now. I'd let it go wild after he died, unable to find joy in the careful cultivation that had once brought me peace. The roses had grown leggy and wild, their blooms smaller but somehow more honest than the perfect specimens I used to tend with such devotion. From this chair, I could see into the kitchen window where Lucas moved like a stranger, opening cabinets and refrigerator with the casual ownership of someone who'd never learned to say thank you. He brought friends over sometimes, the kind of men who spoke in low voices and left cigarette butts on my porch, who looked at my furniture like they were calculating its resale value. I started staying in my room during these visits, reading books I'd abandoned years ago in favor of cookbook magazines and parenting articles. Jane Austen felt different now, her sharp observations about family cruelty and social manipulation hitting closer to home than they had when I was young and optimistic about human nature. The phone calls from my sisters in Ohio became shorter, more stilted. How could I explain that my son, their beloved nephew who'd charmed them at every family gathering, had become someone I no longer recognized? How could I admit that the boy they remembered sending birthday cards to, the one who used to call me his best friend, now spoke to me like I was a burden he couldn't wait to shed? "Elena, you sound tired," my sister Marie said during one of our weekly conversations. "Are you taking care of yourself?" "Taking care of myself." The phrase felt foreign, like a language I'd once known but forgotten how to speak. "I'm fine, just adjusting to having Lucas home again. How's he doing? Any luck with the job search?" I watched through my bedroom window as Lucas loaded something into the trunk of his car. Something heavy, wrapped in an old blanket. He's figuring things out. Well, I'm sure having his mother's support means everything to him. After Marie hung up, I sat holding the silent phone, thinking about support and what it really meant. Was it support when you enabled someone's cruelty by accepting it without protest? Was it love when you made excuses for behavior that grew more disturbing every day? Was it maternal devotion, or was it cowardice dressed up in prettier words? The insurance money envelope grew thinner each week. Lucas never asked directly anymore. He'd learned that subtle manipulation worked better than outright demands. A casual mention of his car needing repairs. A utility bill left deliberately open on the counter. A heavy sigh while scrolling through job listings that seemed to require skills he'd never bothered to develop. Each time, I found myself reaching for my checkbook, telling myself it was temporary help, investment in his future. The last time I'd need to bridge the gap between his needs and his abilities. Each time, the money disappeared without gratitude or acknowledgement, swallowed into whatever bottomless pit of need had opened up inside my son. I stopped balancing my checkbook. It was easier to ignore the mathematics of my own diminishment than to face how quickly I was spending down the security Richard had tried to leave me. Some things were too painful to calculate precisely. One evening, as autumn rain drummed against the kitchen windows, I attempted something I hadn't done in months. I called Lucas to dinner, not with the desperate hopefulness of earlier attempts, but with the simple courtesy I might show a boarder. "Lucas, dinner's ready." He emerged from his room looking annoyed, as if my voice had interrupted something important. What is it? Spaghetti. There's garlic bread in the oven. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals when he was young. Back then, dinner had been our time to connect, to share stories about school and friends and dreams for the future. Now the silence stretched between us like an ocean neither of us knew how to cross. Mom, his voice cut through the quiet, and I looked up hopefully, thinking maybe some remnant of our old connection might resurface. Yes? I need you to co-sign on an apartment for me. The hope died as quickly as it had sparked. An apartment? Yeah, there's a place downtown. 2-bedroom. Really nice. The landlord just needs someone with good credit to guarantee the lease. I set down my fork, studying his face. Lucas, you don't have a job. How would you pay rent? Something flickered behind his eyes. Anger, maybe. Or calculation. I'm working on some opportunities. Big things. You wouldn't understand the business side of it. What kind of opportunities? The kind that pay better than anything you've ever imagined. He leaned forward, and for a moment I saw a flash of the enthusiasm he'd shown as a child when describing his latest adventure. There's good money in helping people solve problems, Mom. Really good money. The way he said helping people made my skin crawl. Combined with his new friends, his unexplained absences, the tools that had gone missing from Ruth's shed, I didn't want to know what kind of problems Lucas had started solving for money. I can't co-sign for an apartment. The words came out stronger than I'd expected. His face hardened instantly. Why not? Because you have no income. Because I don't know what you're really doing with your time. Because I'm not comfortable putting my credit at risk for something I don't understand. He stared at me for a long moment, as if seeing me clearly for the first time in months. You know what your problem is, Mom? You think you still get a say in my life. I think I get a say in whether I co-sign financial documents. Fine. He pushed back from the table so abruptly his chair nearly toppled. I'll figure it out myself, but don't expect me to keep playing house with you much longer. Don't expect me to pretend this. He gestured around the kitchen. Means anything to me. After he stormed out, I sat alone with our half-eaten dinner, watching the steam rise from cooling pasta. The kitchen felt impossibly large around me, every surface echoing with the ghosts of better times. I thought about the photo albums tucked away in my bedroom closet, filled with evidence of a love that had once seemed unbreakable. That night, I did something I hadn't done since Richard died. I pulled out a box from the back of my bedroom closet, hidden behind winter coats and forgotten Christmas decorations. Inside were things Lucas didn't know I'd kept. Things I'd saved not because they were valuable, but because they told the truth about who he'd been before life hardened him into someone I barely recognized. Report cards from elementary school, filled with teachers' comments about his kindness and empathy. A Mother's Day card he'd made in 2nd grade, decorated with crayon hearts, and a poem about how I was the best mom in the universe. Photos from our camping trips, back when it was just the two of us, and he'd insist on sharing his s'mores because he thought they tasted better when we ate them together. Letters. Dozens of letters he'd written me from college, full of homesickness and gratitude and promises to call more often. I know I don't say it enough, one of them read, but you're the reason I believe good people still exist in the world. Thank you for showing me what love looks like. I held that letter against my chest and cried for the first time since this nightmare began. Not the angry tears of betrayal or the hopeless tears of abandonment, but something deeper. Grief for the person Lucas used to be. Mourning for the mother-son relationship that had been real once, even if it felt like a fairy tale now. As I carefully returned everything to the box, my fingers brushed against something at the very bottom. A small digital recorder I'd forgotten was there. Richard had given it to me during his illness, when the medication made his thinking fuzzy and he wanted to record important thoughts before he forgot them. I'd kept it after he died, unable to throw away something that had captured his voice in those final months. But as I held it now, an idea began to form, dark and necessary, and unlike anything the old Elena would have considered. But they didn't know what I had kept all along. The next morning brought an unexpected clarity, as if the tears I'd shed over those old letters had washed away months of confusion and self-doubt. I woke before dawn and made myself coffee in Richard's favorite mug, the one with the chip on the handle that I'd been avoiding because it reminded me too much of better times. Instead of avoiding the memories, I let them come. Richard's laugh when I burned the Christmas cookies our first year of marriage. The way he'd wrap his arms around me from behind while I was cooking, resting his chin on my shoulder and telling me about his day. The morning ritual of reading the newspaper together, trading sections and commenting on articles that caught our attention. Had there really been divorce papers? The question felt less urgent now, less capable of destroying me. Even if Lucas had been telling the truth, and I suspected he wasn't, it didn't erase 30 years of shared mornings, shared struggles, shared joy. People could contemplate leaving and still choose to stay. They could have doubts and still find their way back to love. More importantly, I realized I'd been asking the wrong question. Instead of wondering whether Richard had truly loved me, I should have been asking whether I'd truly loved myself. I pulled out my old teaching journals, dusty volumes I'd kept during my 30-year career, filled with observations about child development and learning strategies. As I read through them, a different version of myself emerged from the pages, confident, insightful, someone who understood human nature with remarkable clarity. Tommy's aggression isn't really about anger. I'd written about a particularly difficult student. It's about fear. He's learned that being scary is safer than being vulnerable. The key isn't to punish the aggression, but to create enough safety that he can afford to put down his armor. I'd written similar observations about dozens of children over the years, seeing past their difficult behaviors to the pain underneath, understanding that cruelty often came from people who felt powerless, that manipulation was frequently the last resort of those who believed they had no other way to get their needs met. When had I stopped applying that wisdom to my own life? When had I started taking Lucas's cruelty at face value instead of recognizing it as the desperate flailing of someone drowning in his own failures? The Elena who had written those journals wouldn't have accepted months of emotional abuse disguised as honesty. She would have seen the pattern, understood the psychology, and responded with both compassion and boundaries. She would have recognized that enabling someone's worst impulses wasn't love. It was fear masquerading as kindness. I spent the day reclaiming small pieces of my former self. I called Margaret from the book club and told her I'd be at the next meeting. I drove to the garden center and bought bulbs for spring planting, daffodils and crocuses that would bloom whether anyone appreciated them or not. I made a hair appointment, something I'd been postponing for months because Lucas always seemed to need money for more pressing concerns. When he came home that evening, I was sitting in the living room reading Pride and Prejudice, a book I'd taught countless times but hadn't revisited since retiring. He paused in the doorway, perhaps sensing something different in the air. "What are you doing?" "Reading." I didn't look up from the page. Elizabeth Bennet always makes more sense to me during difficult times. "Who?" I glanced up then, studying his face. The Lucas I'd raised had read that book in high school, had written an essay about moral courage that earned him the English department award his senior year. But this stranger wearing my son's face showed no recognition of the name, as if the education I'd supported and the values I'd tried to instill had been completely erased. "Never mind," I said softly, returning to my book. "How was your day?" He seemed thrown by the casual question, the absence of the anxiety that usually colored my interactions with him. "Fine. I was thinking about dinner. There's sandwich meat in the refrigerator. Help yourself." "You're not cooking?" I looked up again, taking in his expectant expression, the way he stood in the doorway as if waiting for me to leap up and fulfill his unstated demand. "No, not tonight. I had a large lunch." The lie came easily, though I hadn't eaten since my morning coffee. But something about his assumption that I would automatically provide for him, without appreciation, without acknowledgement, without even basic courtesy, struck me as profoundly wrong. He made himself a sandwich with obvious irritation, slamming cabinet doors and muttering under his breath about inconvenience and selfishness. I continued reading, letting his displeasure wash over me without absorbing it into my bloodstream the way I'd been doing for months. Later that evening, I heard him on the phone in his room, his voice carrying through the thin walls with an urgency that made me pay attention despite my newfound determination to respect his privacy. "I told you, I'm working on it." "No, she's being difficult. I know what we agreed. Just give me another week." The conversation continued in whispers I couldn't make out, but the tone was clear. Lucas owed someone something, and that something was significant enough to make him sound genuinely afraid. Part of me wanted to knock on his door, to offer whatever help he needed, to throw myself back into the familiar role of problem solver and protector. Instead, I stayed where I was and asked myself a question that cut through years of conditioned response. What would happen if I let Lucas face the consequences of his own choices? The answer should have terrified me. As his mother, I'd spent 32 years believing that his pain was my pain, his failures were my failures, his problems were mine to solve. But sitting in my quiet living room, surrounded by books that reminded me of who I'd been before I became defined entirely by other people's needs, the prospect of letting him struggle felt less like abandonment and more like respect. Respect for his intelligence, even when he made poor choices. Respect for his agency, even when he used it destructively. Respect for his right to learn from his mistakes, even when those lessons came with a price I didn't want him to pay. 3 days later, while Lucas was out with his mysterious friends, I did something I hadn't done in years. I cleaned out Richard's study, not to erase his memory, but to reclaim the space for myself. I'd been avoiding that room since his death, treating it like a shrine to a life that was over instead of recognizing it as potential space for a life that was still being written. Behind Richard's desk, I found a small fireproof safe I'd forgotten existed. Inside were our important documents, but also something else. A letter addressed to me in Richard's handwriting, dated just 2 months before his death. "My dearest Elena," it began, and my hands shook as I read the words that followed. "If you're reading this, it means I'm gone and you've finally gotten brave enough to clean out my mess. I know you've been avoiding this room, probably turning it into some kind of monument to our marriage. Stop that. I was a good husband, but I wasn't a saint. And our marriage wasn't a fairy tale. It was better than that. It was real. I want you to know that I never stopped being grateful that you chose me. Not once. Not even during the worst parts of being sick when I know I wasn't easy to live with. You have a gift for loving people through their difficult seasons, but Elena, you've never learned how to love yourself with that same gentleness. When I'm gone, don't make me your excuse for shrinking. Don't make grief your permanent address. You were magnificent before you met me, and you'll be magnificent after I'm gone. The only person who's ever doubted that is you." The letter continued with practical matters. Insurance information, investment accounts I didn't know existed, instructions for maintaining the house. But it was the final paragraph that broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. "Take care of Lucas, but don't let him become your project. He's a good man underneath all that anger, but he needs to find his own way to that goodness. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for someone is refuse to save them from themselves. You taught me that, even if you never realized it. Be happy, Elena. Not someday when everyone else is happy. Now. Today. You have my permission if you need it, though I hope you'll learn to give yourself permission instead. All my love. Always. Richard." I sat in that dusty study, holding Richard's words and feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates rearranging themselves into a new landscape. He hadn't left me because I was suffocating. He'd left me a roadmap for becoming myself again. It wasn't pain anymore. It was clarity. That night, I made a decision that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. I opened a checking account in my name alone and transferred half of the remaining insurance money into it. Not to hide it from Lucas, but to protect it from my own inability to say no to someone I loved, who was drowning in his own poor choices. The other half would remain available if he truly needed help. Medical emergency, legitimate job opportunity, something that felt like investment rather than enablement, but no more casual requests for car repairs that never seemed to actually happen. No more utility bills that disappeared without improving our living situation. No more money flowing out of my security and into whatever black hole had opened up in my son's life. As I drove home from the bank, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Not the fragile, anxious peace of someone walking on eggshells, but the solid, grounded peace of someone who had finally stopped abandoning herself in the name of love. The woman driving that car was still Lucas's mother. She was still Richard's widow, but she was also Elena Morrison, teacher, reader, gardener, human being with value that existed independent of her usefulness to other people. And she was done apologizing for taking up space in her own life. The change in me didn't go unnoticed. Over the following week, I caught Lucas watching me with a new kind of attention, as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become more complex than he'd expected. The woman who used to flinch at his harsh words now responded with calm acknowledgement. The mother who used to chase his approval now moved through the house with quiet purpose that had nothing to do with his needs. "You seem different," he said one morning, finding me in the garden planting the bulbs I'd bought. I was on my knees in the dirt, my hands dark with soil, feeling more grounded than I had in months. Different how? I didn't look up from the daffodil bulbs I was nestling into the earth. I don't know. Less, he searched for the word, less desperate. I sat back on my heels and considered his observation. I suppose that's accurate. Why? The directness of the question surprised me. For months, our conversations had been layered with subtext and manipulation, but this felt genuinely curious, almost vulnerable. I remembered who I was before I forgot, I said simply, returning to my planting. These will bloom in the spring. Daffodils always come back, no matter how harsh the winter. He lingered for a moment longer, then went back inside. Through the kitchen window, I watched him pace the room like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear. The conversation was brief, but agitated, ending with him throwing the phone onto the counter hard enough that I heard the crack of the screen from the garden. That afternoon, Ruth Patterson knocked on my door again, but this time her expression carried urgency rather than concern. "Elena, I need to tell you something." She glanced over her shoulder toward Lucas's car in the driveway. "Is he home?" "Yes." "Why? Can we talk privately? Maybe at my house?" Minutes later, I sat in Ruth's immaculate living room, accepting a cup of tea I didn't want while she gathered the courage to say whatever had brought her here. "I saw Lucas yesterday," she began carefully, "at the hardware store downtown. He was with those friends of his, but Elena, they weren't shopping. They were talking to Eddie Morrison, you know, the one who runs the pawn shop next door." My stomach tightened. "Talking about what?" "I couldn't hear everything, but I heard your name, and I heard them mention something about insurance money." Ruth leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Elena, I think they were planning something." "What kind of something?" "I don't know exactly, but Eddie Morrison isn't known for legitimate business dealings, and the way they were all looking at that photo Lucas showed them." She hesitated, then pulled out her phone. "I took a picture. I hope you don't mind, but something felt wrong about the whole situation." The image on her screen was grainy but clear enough. Lucas stood with 3 men I didn't recognize, holding what looked like a photograph. Even from Ruth's distant perspective, I could see the intensity of their conversation, the way they huddled together like conspirators. What photograph was he showing them? I couldn't tell, but it looked like it might have been of your house. Ruth set down her teacup with shaking hands. "Elena, I think you need to be very careful. Those men, they're not the kind of people who visit someone's home for social reasons." Walking back to my house, I felt as if I were seeing it through different eyes. The sturdy brick construction that had always represented security now felt vulnerable. The mature trees that provided privacy now seemed to offer too many shadows where danger could hide. The quiet neighborhood that had been my sanctuary for over a decade suddenly felt isolated, too far from help if help were needed. Inside, Lucas was sitting at the kitchen table with papers spread before him. When I entered, he quickly gathered them up, but not before I caught a glimpse of official-looking documents with my name prominently displayed. "What are you working on?" I asked, my voice carefully neutral. "Nothing important, just some stuff for the apartment applications." But his hands were shaking slightly as he stuffed the papers into a folder, and his eyes couldn't quite meet mine. "I thought you'd given up on the apartment idea." "No, I'm still pursuing it. Found some new options." He stood abruptly, clutching the folder to his chest. "I'll be out for dinner again tonight. Don't wait up." After he left, I stood in my kitchen trying to shake the feeling that I was being watched, studied, evaluated for weaknesses I didn't know I possessed. The house felt different, not like the safe haven it had been for years, but like a stage set where everyone knew their roles except me. I called my sister Marie that evening, needing to hear a familiar voice that carried no undercurrents of threat or manipulation. "Elena, I was just thinking about you. How are things?" I paused, unsure how to explain the growing sense that my life was balanced on the edge of some precipice I couldn't see. "They're changing. Is Lucas doing better?" "I don't know. I think he might be planning to move out soon." The words felt like a test, a way of speaking a possibility into existence to see how it sounded. "That's probably for the best, don't you think? You've both been through so much loss. Maybe some space would be healthy." Space. The word echoed in my mind long after we hung up. Yes, space would be healthy, but I was beginning to suspect that Lucas had no intention of creating space through normal means like finding his own apartment and building his own life. The urgency I'd heard in his phone conversations, the mysterious meetings with questionable men, the way he'd been studying me lately, It all pointed toward something more dramatic than a simple change of address. That night, I did something I'd never done before in my own home. I locked my bedroom door. Not because I believed Lucas would hurt me physically, but because trust, once broken, required concrete actions to rebuild. And right now, I didn't trust the stranger my son had become, didn't trust his motivations or his associates or his increasingly desperate energy. I lay in bed listening to the sounds of the house settling around me, every creak of floorboard or whisper of wind against windows making me more alert instead of more sleepy. Around midnight, I heard the front door open and close, followed by hushed voices in the living room below. Male voices, multiple speakers, talking in the careful undertones of people who didn't want to be overheard. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, punctuated by occasional bursts of what sounded like argument, then hushed again to whispers I couldn't decipher. When car doors slammed outside and engines started up, I crept to my bedroom window and watched 3 vehicles leave my driveway in a convoy that looked more like a military operation than a social visit. Lucas's footsteps on the stairs were heavy, tired. His bedroom door closed with unusual gentleness, as if he were trying not to disturb me. The consideration felt ominous rather than thoughtful. The next morning brought unseasonably warm weather, the kind of false spring that sometimes arrives in early winter to fool the flowers into blooming too soon. I was drinking coffee on the back porch when I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The lock on my garden shed had been changed. I walked across the yard on unsteady legs, my coffee mug forgotten on the porch table. The old combination lock I'd used for years was gone, replaced by a heavy-duty padlock that required a key. When I peered through the small window, I could see that my gardening tools had been moved aside to make room for several large objects covered by tarps. I tried the door handle anyway, knowing it would be locked but needing to confirm my growing suspicion that my own property was being used for purposes I wasn't meant to understand. The door didn't budge, and the new lock gleamed in the morning sunlight like a warning. Standing there in my own backyard, staring at a building I'd owned for over a decade but could no longer access, I felt the last pieces of my old life crumble away. This wasn't just about Lucas's emotional cruelty anymore, or his financial manipulation, or even his association with questionable people. This was about my home being transformed into something dangerous without my knowledge or consent. This was about being made a stranger in my own life while maintaining the illusion that I still had some control over my circumstances. As I walked back toward the house, I noticed Lucas watching me from his bedroom window. When our eyes met, he didn't look away or pretend he hadn't been observing my discovery. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculating expression that belonged on the face of someone I'd never met, not the child I'd carried in my body and raised with every ounce of love I possessed. That smile told me everything I needed to know about what was coming, even if I didn't yet understand the specifics. Change was no longer approaching slowly, building like a summer thunderstorm on the horizon. It was here, crackling in the air around me like electricity before lightning strikes, and all I could do was stand in my own yard and wait for the sky to fall. The confrontation came the next evening, in the most ordinary way possible. Lucas emerged from his room carrying a glass of what looked like iced tea, his manner unusually solicitous as he approached where I sat reading in the living room. "Mom, I made you something." His voice carried a warmth I hadn't heard in months, and for a split second, my heart leaped with hope that maybe, somehow, we'd found our way back to each other. He held out the glass with both hands, like a peace offering. "It's that herbal tea you like, with honey." I thought, maybe we could talk. I looked at the glass, then at his face. The smile was there, broad and familiar, exactly like the one he'd worn as a child when he'd done something thoughtful and wanted recognition for his kindness. But his eyes were wrong, too bright, too focused, watching my reaction with the intensity of someone waiting for a specific outcome. "That's very sweet of you." I accepted the glass but didn't drink from it, setting it on the side table instead. "What did you want to talk about?" His smile flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "Well, I've been thinking about what you said, about me needing to be more independent, and you're right. I am? Yeah, I've been selfish, taking advantage of your generosity. It's time for me to stand on my own feet." He gestured toward the glass. "Your tea's getting warm." There it was, the subtle pressure, the gentle insistence that I drink what he'd brought me. Combined with everything else I'd observed over the past weeks, the pieces of a horrible puzzle began clicking into place with crystalline clarity. Lucas, what's really in this tea? His mask slipped entirely then, the false warmth draining from his features like water from a broken vessel. What do you mean? I mean, what did you put in it besides honey? We stared at each other across the living room, and I watched my son make a calculation I prayed I was wrong about. When he spoke again, his voice carried none of the artificial sweetness from moments before. You're being paranoid. Am I? I stood up, leaving the glass where it sat. Should I drink this tea, Lucas? Should I trust that my own son brought me something safe to drink? The question hung between us like a sword, sharp-edged and unavoidable. In the silence that followed, I heard everything he wasn't saying, the confirmation of my worst fears written across his face in expressions he was no longer skilled enough to hide. You know what your problem is, Mom? His voice turned conversational, almost friendly, as if we were discussing the weather. You think too much. You always have. Dad used to say it was exhausting, the way you'd analyze every little thing instead of just accepting what was right in front of you. What's right in front of me, Lucas? A son who's trying to take care of his mother. He moved closer, and I noticed he was positioning himself between me and the front door. A son who's found a solution to both our problems. What problems are those? Your problem is that you're getting older, Mom. You're becoming unreliable, forgetful. The neighbors have noticed. Mrs. Patterson mentioned to Eddie Morrison that she's concerned about your mental state lately, how you've been acting confused, paranoid, talking about things that don't make sense. The casual way he delivered this revelation made my blood turn to ice. He'd been building a narrative, creating a foundation for whatever he had planned. I haven't been acting confused. Haven't you? All those bills you've been forgetting to pay? The way you've been hoarding money instead of using it for reasonable expenses? The paranoid thoughts about my friends, the way you've been accusing me of things I never did. His smile was gentle, understanding, the expression of a concerned son dealing with a declining parent. It's sad, really, but treatable. Treatable how? There are facilities, Mom. Really nice places where people with your condition can get the help they need. Places where you'd be safe, supervised, properly medicated. He glanced toward the untouched glass of tea. The transition would be so much easier if you'd just cooperate. Understanding crashed over me like a wave. The insurance money, the mysterious documents I'd glimpsed, the meetings with questionable men, the changed lock on my garden shed. Lucas hadn't been planning to move out. He'd been planning to have me declared incompetent and committed, clearing the way for him to claim control of my assets and my property. How long have you been planning this? Since Dad died, really. But seriously, since I moved back in and saw how much you'd deteriorated. He spoke with the clinical detachment of someone discussing a business transaction. It's not personal, Mom. You're just in the way now. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. Not just the betrayal, but the systematic way he'd been manufacturing evidence of my supposed decline, while simultaneously creating the conditions that would make such a decline seem plausible. Every argument, every moment of confusion, every instance where I'd questioned my own perceptions, he'd been building a case against my competency. The tea, I said quietly. What's in it? Nothing that would hurt you permanently. Just something to help you relax, make the transition easier when the ambulance comes. His tone was almost reassuring. Eddie knows someone at the hospital who'll make sure the intake evaluation goes smoothly. You'll be diagnosed with early-stage dementia, maybe some paranoid delusions. Very sad, but not uncommon for women your age. And then you get the care you need, and I make sure your assets are properly managed. Win-win. He gestured again toward the glass. Come on, Mom. Don't make this harder than it has to be. I looked at my son, really looked at him, and saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. This wasn't the boy I'd raised, the young man I'd sacrificed for, the child whose scraped knees I'd kissed and whose nightmares I'd chased away. This was someone who'd learned to weaponize my love against me, who'd turned my maternal instincts into tools for my own destruction. But I was no longer the woman who would drink poison rather than disappoint someone she loved. The Elena who had rediscovered her strength in Richard's letter and her own teaching journals was looking at this situation with clear eyes, seeing it for what it was, not a family crisis, but a criminal conspiracy. No, I said simply. No, I'm not going to drink the tea, Lucas. I'm not going to make your plan easier for you. I walked toward the front door, and he moved to block my path. and I'm not going to pretend this conversation didn't happen. Mom, you're not thinking clearly. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in months. I pulled out my phone, and his eyes widened as he realized what I was about to do. I'm calling the police. He lunged for the phone, grabbing my wrist with enough force to leave bruises. You can't do that. Why? Because you've already told them I'm mentally incompetent? I jerked away from his grip, my voice rising. Because you've spent weeks building a story about my declining mental state? Because no one will believe you. The mask was completely gone now, revealing the desperate, vicious person he'd become. I'm your devoted son, who moved home to take care of his widowed mother. You're a confused old woman who's been acting erratically since her husband died. Who do you think they'll believe? He was right, and we both knew it. The story he'd constructed was plausible, sympathetic, and supported by carefully manufactured evidence. A jury of strangers would see a grieving son trying to help his declining mother, not a predator attempting to steal everything from the woman who'd given him life. But there was one thing Lucas didn't know about his supposedly declining mother. One piece of evidence he hadn't accounted for in his careful planning. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the small digital recorder I'd found among Richard's things, the one I'd been carrying since that night I'd discovered it in my closet. The red light blinked steadily, indicating it had captured every word of our conversation. You're right, I said quietly. They probably would believe you, but they'll have a much harder time dismissing a recording of you explaining exactly how you plan to drug me and have me falsely committed. The color drained from his face as he stared at the device in my hand. You recorded this? I've been recording everything for weeks, Lucas. Every cruel word, every manipulation, every threat. I backed toward the door, keeping the recorder visible, including the conversation you had with your friends last night about what was in my garden shed. The fight went out of him all at once, his shoulders sagging as the reality of his situation sank in. You don't understand. I owe people money. Serious people. If I don't pay them back, then you'll face the consequences of your own choices. My voice was steady, final. But you won't destroy me to save yourself. I opened the front door, fresh air rushing in to cleanse the poison that had been building in my home for months. You have 1 hour to pack whatever belongs to you and leave. After that, I'm calling the police and playing them everything I've recorded. Mom, please. I'm not your mother anymore, Lucas. The words came from a place of such deep certainty that they surprised even me. Mothers nurture and protect their children. Children don't destroy their mothers for profit. We're something else now. Strangers who used to love each other. I stepped outside into the evening air, leaving him alone with his shattered plans and the untouched glass of tea that would have stolen my freedom, my sanity, my life. I walked to the bottom of my driveway and called Ruth Patterson. Within minutes, she appeared on her porch, took one look at my face, and hurried over without a word. Sometimes the deepest friendships are built not on shared joy, but on showing up when the world falls apart. Elena, what's happened? I need a witness, I said simply. Lucas is leaving tonight, and I want someone here to see that he goes peacefully. Ruth's eyes widened, but she nodded and positioned herself on my front steps like a guardian. We didn't speak while we waited, but her presence felt like an anchor in the storm that was about to break around us. 45 minutes later, Lucas emerged from the house carrying 2 duffel bags and wearing the hollow expression of someone whose carefully constructed future had just imploded. He loaded his belongings into his car with mechanical precision, never once looking toward where Ruth and I stood watching. When he finished, he turned to face me across the space that had once been our shared driveway, but now felt like the distance between 2 different worlds. I never meant for it to go this far, he said, his voice barely audible in the evening air. When I first thought about the plan, I told myself it was for your own good, that you'd be happier not having to worry about money or making decisions. And now? He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the house where he'd grown up, where I'd nursed him through childhood illnesses and celebrated his achievements and believed in his goodness long after the evidence suggested I should stop. Now, I think I convinced myself of a lot of lies, because the truth was too ugly to face. What truth is that? That I became someone you shouldn't love anymore. His voice cracked slightly. That I became someone I don't want to be. It would have been so easy to comfort him then, to slip back into the familiar role of the mother who smoothed over difficult emotions and offered reassurance that everything could be fixed with enough patience and forgiveness. But the woman I'd rediscovered in Richard's letter and my own strength knew that some wounds needed to heal in the open air, not hidden under bandages of false comfort. "Yes," I said quietly. "You did." He flinched as if I'd struck him, but he didn't argue. Instead, he got into his car and rolled down the window. "The things I told you about Dad, about the divorce papers." He swallowed hard. "That wasn't true. I made it up because I wanted to hurt you." "I know. How did you know?" "Because I loved him for 30 years, and you don't love someone that long without learning to recognize truth from cruelty." I stepped closer to the car, close enough to see the tears he was trying not to shed. "Your father wasn't perfect, Lucas, but he never lied to hurt me, even when he was in pain himself. I'm sorry." The apology hung between us, inadequate and honest in equal measure. I wanted to accept it, to forgive him completely, and invite him back into my life as if the past months had been a nightmare we'd both awakened from. But forgiveness and reconciliation were different things, and only one of them was mine to give unilaterally. "I believe you are sorry," I said, "but being sorry doesn't undo the damage, Lucas. It doesn't erase the fear you've made me feel in my own home, or the trust you've destroyed, or the months of my life you've poisoned with manipulation and lies." He nodded, tears flowing freely now. "What happens next? I don't know. That depends on you, on whether you get help, whether you find a way to become someone worth trusting again, whether you learn to build a life instead of trying to steal one." I touched the roof of his car gently. "But it happens somewhere else, not here. This house is my sanctuary again, and you're not welcome in it until you're someone I can feel safe with. What if that never happens?" The question broke my heart, but not in the way it would have months earlier when I believed that my happiness depended on his. Now it broke my heart for him, for the man he could have been, for the relationship we might have had if he'd chosen differently, for the grandson he'd never give me, and the son I'd effectively lost the moment he decided to see me as an obstacle instead of a person. "Then we'll both have to live with that loss," I said. "But I won't sacrifice myself on the altar of your potential anymore, Lucas. I won't set myself on fire to keep you warm." After he drove away, Ruth and I stood in the gathering dusk, listening to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into evening routines that seemed miraculous in their normalcy. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I think I will be." The next morning, I called a locksmith to change every lock on the house, then spent the day reclaiming the spaces that had been contaminated by fear and manipulation. I cleaned out Lucas's room, donating his abandoned belongings to charity and opening the windows to air that had grown stagnant with secrets and resentment. In my garden shed, I found exactly what I'd expected: stolen goods Lucas's new friends had been using my property to hide. I called the police, turned over the evidence, and watched as my shed was returned to its rightful purpose of housing gardening tools and seasonal decorations. 2 weeks later, I got a call from Detective Rodriguez, the officer who'd handled my case. "Mrs. Morrison, I wanted you to know that your son has been arrested in connection with several burglaries in the area. The recording you provided was instrumental in connecting him to a larger theft ring." I sat in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling neither satisfaction nor grief, but something more complex, a sense that justice had been served, even though it had come at a cost no mother should have to pay. "Will he go to prison?" "Probably, yes. But Mrs. Morrison, he asked me to tell you something. He said to tell you that he's going to get clean, that he's going to use this time to figure out who he wants to be when he grows up." After the call ended, I walked to my mailbox and found an envelope with my name written in Lucas's handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper with words that would have meant everything to me months earlier, but now felt like the closing of a door rather than its opening. "Mom, I know I don't deserve forgiveness, and I'm not asking for it. I'm asking for something harder, the chance to become someone who might earn it someday. I know that might never happen, but I need to try. Not for you, but for me. The person you raised is still in here somewhere under all the damage I've done to both of us. Maybe prison will help me find him again. Don't wait for me. Don't build your life around the hope that I'll change. Build it around the fact that you deserve happiness whether I ever get my act together or not. Thank you for not giving up on yourself when I gave up on everything else. Love, Lucas." I folded the letter and put it in Richard's study, in the desk drawer where I now kept important documents and future plans. It would stay there, not as a reminder of pain, but as evidence that even in the darkest circumstances, people sometimes find their way back to truth. Spring came early that year, and my daffodils bloomed exactly when they were supposed to, pushing through the earth with the quiet determination of living things that understand their purpose. I tended my garden every morning, coffee in hand, watching the neighborhood wake up around me. Margaret called to invite me to rejoin the book club, and I said yes. I volunteered at the literacy program at the community college, teaching adults to read with the same patience I'd once brought to my classroom. I had dinner with friends, took a pottery class, planned a trip to Maine to see those lighthouses I'd dreamed about. I didn't do these things to prove to anyone that I was fine, or to fill the empty spaces Lucas had left behind. I did them because I was a person whose life had value independent of her usefulness to other people, whose happiness mattered even when no one else was around to witness or validate it. Sometimes I thought about Lucas, wondered whether he was keeping his promise to himself, whether prison was teaching him the lessons that freedom never had. But I didn't build my days around those thoughts. I didn't check the calendar counting down to his potential release date, didn't plan conversations we might have or conditions that would need to be met before I could trust him again. If he found his way back to the person I'd raised, I would be here. If he didn't, I would still be here, not waiting, not hoping, not sacrificing my own peace for his potential, but living fully in whatever life I'd chosen to build for myself. 6 months after Lucas left, I was working in my garden when a young couple walked by with a toddler. The little boy broke free from his mother's hand and ran toward my fence, attracted by the bright orange marigolds I'd planted along the border. "Flowers!" he shouted with pure delight, his face glowing with the kind of joy that comes from discovering something beautiful. His mother hurried over, apologetic and embarrassed. "I'm so sorry. He's at that age where everything catches his attention." "Don't apologize," I said, smiling at the little boy who was now trying to touch the flowers through the fence. "Beauty should catch our attention. That's what it's for." I picked one of the marigolds and handed it to him through the fence. His eyes widened as if I'd given him treasure, which in a way I had. "What do you say?" his mother prompted. "Thank you," he said, then ran back to his parents holding the flower carefully in his small fist. I watched them continue down the street, the little boy chattering excitedly about his flower, his parents listening with the patient attention that good love provides. For a moment, I felt the familiar ache of missing the child Lucas had been, the innocence that had been lost somewhere in his journey to adulthood. But the ache passed quickly, replaced by something stronger and more sustaining. Gratitude for the mother I'd been to that innocent child, for the love I'd given when it was received with joy, for the years when my care had been a gift rather than a burden. I returned to my gardening, my hands deep in soil that would nurture whatever I chose to plant, in a garden that belonged entirely to me, in a life I'd fought to reclaim from people who thought my value could be measured by their need for me. The afternoon sun felt warm on my shoulders, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear children playing and cars starting and life continuing its ordinary, miraculous routine all around me. Sometimes silence is the loudest truth.